When we talk about World War II, many people's minds immediately go to the trenches of Europe, the bombers over London, or the tanks crossing the African desert. But for me, one of the most fascinating and at the same time most cruel scenarios was the vast and unpredictable Pacific Ocean. There, amidst isolated islands and deep waters, a completely different war was fought. A war dominated not by infantry armies, but by ships and planes. And among those planes, there was one that kept the Allies awake at night, the Japanese torpedo bomber. Few outside the military aviation circle truly understand the impact of these machines. Called Kate by the Allies, but officially known as Nakajima B5N at first glance, these bombers seemed fragile and antiquated. They had a thin fuselage, long wings, and fixed landing gear in the early versions. Nothing that would attract attention. But what the Americans and British soon discovered is that in the right hands, this aircraft was deadly. Japan had understood something that many still underestimated at the beginning of the war: air supremacy over the sea. A torpedo bomber could do the work of an entire ship, and with much greater range. Imagine a small squadron of planes taking off from an aircraft carrier, flying low over the waves, invisible to the primitive radar of the time, and suddenly launching torpedoes that glided across the water straight towards the hulls of enemy destroyers and cruisers. A silent, quick, and devastating blow. I remember studying the accounts of American pilots, their astonishment at realizing that these planes were capable of coordinating precise attacks, often in sync with bomber divers. It was as if the enemy had choreographed a deadly dance. And in a way, there was indeed an art behind these attacks. The Japanese doctrine of naval warfare was deeply disciplined, and the pilots were trained with an almost superhuman level of rigor. The Nakajima B5N, he gained fame early in the conflict. He was primarily responsible for the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. While dive bombers destroyed planes on the ground and fuel tanks, the Kates entered the fray with their torpedoes, tearing through the waters of the bay and hitting ships like the USS Oklahoma and the USS West Virginia. Within minutes, the American Pacific Fleet was ablaze, and it was there that the world saw for the first time the true power of a Japanese torpedo bomber. But that was just the first sample. What would come next would show that this aircraft was not just an offensive weapon, it was a lesson in strategy, discipline, and the Japanese obsession with combat efficiency. Behind the scenes of the war, each new Allied advance was accompanied by a question that was repeated among naval commanders: how can we stop these planes? And that's where our journey begins, a journey that goes far beyond metal and propellers, and into the heart of a machine that changed the balance of war in the Pacific. When I began to study the Nakajima B5N in depth, I realized that it wasn't born by chance. It was the product of a war philosophy. Japan, in the 1930s, was already planning to expand its naval and air power long before Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Islands weren't just pieces of land on the map. They were strategic pieces on a colossal chessboard. And on that chessboard, the Japanese knew they would need a specific piece, an aircraft capable of destroying ships before the enemy could even react. In 1935, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a challenge to its aeronautical industries to create a torpedo bomber that would surpass anything else in the world. It was to have wide reach, superior speed and torpedo, carrying capacity of 800 kilon, something impressive for the time. The man who accepted the challenge was Katsuji Nakamura, chief engineer of Nakajima. Aircraft company Nakamura knew he was about to create something that could change the course of the war. The first prototype of what would become the B5N-1 it flew in January 1937, and what was impressive was not just its technical performance, it was the balance between lightness and efficiency. While Western aircraft of the time were heavy and armored, the Kate followed a different philosophy: speed instead of protection. The Japanese reasoning was simple. A plane that's fast enough doesn't need armor. It will never be hit. And for a time, that logic worked. The B5N had 3 crew members. The team consisted of the pilot, the navigator bombardier, and the radio operator gunner. Communication between them was essential, and each mission required near-perfect synchronization. The aircraft could reach speeds exceeding 370 km/h, with range of over 1,000 kilometers, enough to reach distant targets and return safely to aircraft carriers. Its metal structure was simple yet reliable, and the engine Nakajima B5N offered sufficient power for long-range missions. But what really put Kate ahead of her rivals was the torpedo launch technology. Japan developed torpedoes specifically adapted for shallow waters, crucial for attacks like the one on Pearl Harbor. While traditional torpedoes sank too low and missed their target, the Japanese adjusted their fins and stability systems, allowing them to glide through the water at a depth of just a few meters. It was an innovation that caught the Allies completely by surprise. For me, what's most fascinating is realizing that the success of the B5N wasn't just in its design, but in mindset that created him. Japan viewed its aircraft as extensions of its pilots, and its pilots in turn as extensions of the imperial will. Each mission was treated as an act of devotion, and this mixture of technology and fanaticism resulted in what Americans later called the Steel Nightmare of the Pacific. Throughout 1939 and 1940, the B5N was tested in combat in China and in attacks against British forces in Asia. It was in these early confrontations that the world began to realize Japan had created a silent predator, capable of coordinated and lethal operations. The enemy didn't yet know it, but the Kate would be the spearhead of an offensive that would change naval history forever. I still remember the first time I heard the accounts of the Japanese pilots who participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. The way they described the operation wasn't with euphoria or arrogance, but with a kind of reverence. For them, it wasn't just a military mission, it was a sacred duty. And at the heart of that attack was the aircraft that would become a legend, the Nakajima B5N, the feared torpedo bomber known to the Allies as Kate. The early morning of December 7, 1941, dawned calm in Hawaii. American ships were anchored, many with crews relaxing on a sunny Sunday. Little did they know that hundreds of kilometers away, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, the Akagi from Soryu, Hiryu, Shokakuan, Zuikaku, they sailed in silence, carrying more than 350 aircraft. Among them were dozens of B5Ns, armed with torpedoes and 800 kiloton bombs. At 6 a.m., the first strike group took off. The war in the Pacific was about to begin. While dive bombers Val, they attacked ground targets and the fighter jets, Zero ensuring air superiority. The Kates glided close to the waves in near-perfect formation. I imagined the tension in the cockpit, the pilot controlling the plane with precision, the navigator calculating the trajectory, and the gunner attentive to the horizon. In a few minutes, they spotted the American fleet. The moment had arrived. The first torpedo was launched at 7:55 a.m. In seconds, the waters around the naval base became chaotic. The American crews, caught by surprise, couldn't even react. The B5Ns attacked with frightening precision. Their torpedoes tore through the surface, guided by the modified stability that Japanese engineers had developed specifically for shallow waters. Ships like the USS Oklahoma, USS California, USS West Virginia, and USS Nevada, they were hit in sequence. Each explosion made the sky tremble. In less than 2 hours, Japan had destroyed or damaged 8 battleships, hundreds of aircraft, and inflicted over 2,000 American casualties. The Pacific Fleet was on its knees. It was a surgical strike, and for the Japanese, a near-perfect victory. And all this, in large part, thanks to the performance of the torpedo bomber Kate. But while this victory shocked the world, it also marked the beginning of an era of total confrontation. The success of the attack on Pearl Harbor gave Japan almost blind confidence, leading it to expand rapidly across the Pacific. The Kate then went on to operate in virtually every major naval battle that followed: the Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal. Each mission reinforced the same: fear among Allied sailors. The unmistakable sound of the Nakajima engines echoing over the sea was a sign of imminent death, and while the Americans scrambled to reorganize their fleet and reinforce their anti-aircraft defenses, the Japanese celebrated. They believed they had secured dominance of the seas. But what they didn't imagine was that the same plane that symbolized their power would soon be tested to its limits. The Kate had won its most famous battle, but the greatest trials were yet to come. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Nakajima B5N was no longer just an aircraft. It was a symbol. It represented the strength and precision of the Imperial Japanese Navy, an instrument that had humiliated the United States in a single morning. And Japan, emboldened by this success, decided to further refine this war machine. That's how the B5N2, the most lethal and refined version of the legendary torpedo, bomber. I remember reading the technical reports from that time and realizing how every detail of the new model reflected the Japanese obsession with efficiency. B5N1, although fast, it had limitations. Its 9-cylinder Nakajima Hikari engine was not as powerful as the pilots desired, and the lack of armor made it vulnerable to any frontal attack. Japan knew that if it wanted to maintain naval air supremacy, it would need an urgent upgrade. The B5N2 emerged in 1939, bringing an engine, Nakajima Sakai 11, the same one later used in the famous fighter jet Zero. This new engine was more reliable and powerful, allowing the aircraft to maintain speed even with heavy torpedoes. Furthermore, some aerodynamic modifications made the fuselage cleaner, reducing drag and increasing range. It was, in essence, the perfect combination of speed, stability, and attack power. But what impresses me most is how the Japanese engineers managed to balance simplicity and effectiveness. The cockpit was still cramped, with analog panels and mechanical controls, but everything was logically arranged, designed for combat efficiency. The pilot had a wide field of vision, essential for low-level attacks over the sea. The navigator, positioned in the middle, took care of the coordinates and bombardment aiming. And in the rear, the gunner operated a 7.7mm Type 92 machine gun, the crew's only defense. 3 men, one purpose: to destroy enemy ships. The B5N2 stood out not only for its more powerful engine, it was also adapted for multifunctional missions. It could launch conventional bombs, torpedoes, or even sea mines. This versatility made it a nightmare for the Allies. In 1942, during the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway, squadrons of Kates became central pieces of Japanese strategy. They flew in formation, often in sync with dive bombers, and with air cover from fighter jets Zero. Coordination was impeccable, the result of years of rigorous doctrine and training. The accounts from the American sailors are almost cinematic. They describe the sound of the B5N2 engines approaching, followed by the sharp whistle of torpedoes gliding through the water. Anti-aircraft defenses fired desperately, but the Kates were coming in too low, too fast. It was a difficult attack to stop. Each successful mission reinforced the aircraft's reputation as one of Imperial Japan's most lethal weapons. But there was a price. The lightness that guaranteed speed also meant vulnerability. The B5N2 was made with a thin structure and no armor. A single well-placed shot could instantly set the plane ablaze. And as the Allies improved their defenses and fighter planes, losses began to mount. Still, the Japanese persisted, driven by a spirit of sacrifice bordering on fanaticism. They believed that dying in the line of duty was the highest form of honor. The B5N2's peak also marked the beginning of its decline. The world was changing rapidly, and new, faster and more armored aircraft were beginning to appear on the horizon. Even so, during a crucial period of the war, this torpedo bomber dominated the seas, proving that good strategy and training could compensate even for the fragility of a machine. The Kate had become more than just an aircraft. It was a declaration of power, a silent warning to any fleet that dared to challenge Japan. However, the fate of these machines and their pilots would take a much darker turn in the following months. After Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed invincible. The American fleet was on its knees, and the Kate torpedo bombers had become the messengers of terror in the Pacific Ocean. Every time Allied forces tried to fight back, they were met by disciplined squadrons of B5N2s flying in perfect formation, ready to launch deadly torpedoes. But as in every war, the tide does not remain calm for long. Fate was beginning to turn, and it would show its face for the first time in the turbulent waters of Coral Sea, and then, soon after, in the historic Battle of Midway. I was always struck by the contrast between the beginning and the end of that phase of the war. At the beginning, Japan still dictated the pace. In May 1942, in the Coral Sea, the B5N2s once again demonstrated their strength. It was the first naval battle in history in which the enemy fleets never directly saw each other. Only airplanes engaged in combat, launched from aircraft carriers hundreds of kilometers away. The Japanese attacked with surgical precision, and their Kates managed to seriously damage the USS Lexington and achieve the USS Yorktown, two of the largest American aircraft carriers. The strategy seemed to be working again, but something changed. The Americans began to understand the enemy. U.S. naval intelligence had already deciphered some of the Japanese codes, and this allowed commanders to anticipate the movements of the Imperial fleet. For the first time, the Kates were not facing a defenseless target. USS Yorktown, even damaged, it managed to launch F-4F Wildcat fighters and intensify anti-aircraft defenses. Japanese formations began to suffer losses that would have been unthinkable before. The speed of the B5N2s was no longer sufficient to escape the new Allied coordination, and then it came midway June 1942, the turning point. For many, this was the battle that decided the fate of the Pacific. I often say that Midway was the moment when the Japanese sky began to crumble. Admiral Yamamoto's forces believed they would catch the Americans by surprise once again. But in reality, they were falling into a trap. When the Kates took off from the aircraft carriers, Akagi from Soryu and Hiryu, the enemy was already expecting them. The first wave of B5N2s had some initial success, reaching the Yorktown again with torpedoes, but the price was high. American fighters attacked from all sides, mercilessly strafing the Japanese torpedo bombers, which, lacking armor, turned into fireballs at the slightest impact. The pilots knew they were at a disadvantage, but they didn't back down. Many continued their attacks to the end, even when their fuel tanks were punctured and their wings were ablaze. It was heroic and tragic at the same time. While the Kates were trying to fulfill their role, the American dive bombers dauntless. They found the Japanese aircraft carriers. Within minutes, 3 of them were destroyed. The air power that sustained Japan in the Pacific vanished in flames and explosions. When the last one, Hiryu as the Empire, sank, taking dozens of pilots and planes with it, the Empire of the Rising Sun lost more than ships. It lost the balance of power in the war. The surviving accounts of the Kate pilots are heartbreaking. They knew the world had changed. Tactics that once worked perfectly were now predictable. The lightness that gave them speed had become a death sentence against increasingly efficient fighters and automatic cannons. Yet there was an almost spiritual tenacity in them. They fought not only for victory, but for honor, even when defeat was already looming on the horizon. Midway marked the beginning of the end of Japanese supremacy. The Nakajima B5N, once the terror of the seas, was beginning to be hunted. But even with the American advance, Japan did not give up. And that's when a new stage emerged, a phase where sacrifice and despair would become the soul of Japanese air warfare. The story of the war in the Pacific after Midway is a bitter lesson in determination and despair. Japan, which had once seemed to dominate the skies and seas, began to see its power slowly crumble. And in the midst of this collapse, the men who piloted the torpedo bombers, those who had been the spearhead of Japanese victories, became symbols of resistance and sacrifice. I like to think that the fate of the Kates is, in a way, a portrait of Japan itself during that period, brave, disciplined, and tragic to the end. Following the defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, the Japanese Empire began to lose ground rapidly. Supply lines were getting longer, aircraft carriers were scarce, and veteran pilots, the best in the world at the start of the war, were being decimated in combat. In their place, inexperienced young men took over the cockpits of the B5N2s. Many barely knew how to take off from an aircraft carrier, but they were still sent to the front. The result was predictable. Entire missions ended in tragedy, and yet the spirit of these pilots did not waver. They knew their chances of return were slim, but they set off anyway. The surviving accounts from mechanics and officers of the Imperial Navy are moving. They describe young men smiling before takeoff, writing farewell letters, or tying small flags with the rising sun around their heads. They believed that dying for the Emperor was the highest form of loyalty. The concept of defeat simply did not exist. The Nakajima B5N that time, it was already beginning to show its age. It was slow, vulnerable, and obsolete compared to newer American aircraft such as the Grumman TBF Avenger, which was armored, faster, and equipped with far superior weaponry. But Japan had no choice. The aviation industry was collapsing, and replacing the Kate quickly was impossible. Even when new models began to emerge, such as the B6N Tenzan, the old B5Ns continued flying, often on desperate missions. With no hope of return, it was in this context that a new and terrible tactic emerged. The kamikaze missions. Although the B5N was not designed for this type of attack, many of them ended up being used as suicide planes, loaded with explosives or torpedoes, launching themselves directly against Allied ships. The pilots knew they wouldn't return, but believed that the sacrifice could delay the American advance, give Japan time to breathe, or at least save national honor. I remember one account in particular from a Japanese radio operator who accidentally survived a failed mission. He recounted that during the flight, the pilot maintained a calm tone, even knowing that the fuel would not allow for a return. Before diving towards an American cruiser, he simply said, "May the spirit of the samurai guide us." Those words stuck in my mind. They encapsulate the essence of Japanese aviation at that time: courage, discipline, and resignation in the face of the inevitable. The Kates were hunted mercilessly. American radars improved, fighter planes patrolled the skies day and night, and anti-aircraft guns surrounded every Allied ship like a wall of fire. Even so, there were reports of the occasional successful attack, small flashes of effectiveness amidst a backdrop of defeat. Each of these episodes was celebrated by Japanese propaganda as a heroic victory, even when the human cost was devastating. The decline of the B5N marked the end of an era. The aircraft that had once humiliated the world's greatest naval power was now being shot down in droves, its wreckage floating in the sea it had once dominated. And yet, there is something profoundly human in this story, because even when logic dictated that the war was lost, the Japanese pilots continued fighting, not for victory but out of conviction. The Nakajima B5N, in its final breath, ceased to be merely a weapon. It became a symbol of the persistence of an entire people who preferred to die fighting rather than accept surrender. Every war machine has its moment of glory, and also its twilight. Nakajima B5N, the torpedo bomber, which once spread terror across the Pacific Ocean, met its silent end between 1944 and 1945. Few survivors remained to tell its story, both pilots and aircraft. When I think about it, it's impossible not to feel a mixture of respect and melancholy. Kate, as the Allies called him, had begun the war as the most feared predator of the seas. In the end, he became a reminder of a time when courage and sacrifice seemed to go hand in hand. As the conflict progressed, new aircraft began to dominate the skies. The direct successor to the B5N, the Nakajima B6N Tenzanite, was faster, more powerful and better armed. But ironically, it arrived too late. The Japanese industry no longer had the resources, fuel or trained pilots to take full advantage of its potential. Thus, many squadrons continued operating with the veteran B5Ns until the final months of the war. These planes, worn and patched up, flew with engines that barely maintained altitude, and crews who knew the end was near. Even so, they continued to carry out their missions, as if each flight were a farewell, not just to the war, but to an entire era. I like to think of the Nakajima B5N not just as a machine, but as a symbol of the Japanese spirit of that time. It represented discipline, precision, and above all, total self-sacrifice, the idea that duty came before life itself. This doesn't make it a just weapon after all. War is never just, but it makes it one of the most iconic aircraft of World War II. His trajectory encapsulates the very arc of the war in the Pacific, the triumphant beginning, the height of imperial power, and the slow, painful collapse in the face of the industrial and technological might of the Allies. Many historians, especially Western ones, tend to remember only the American victories: Pearl Harbor, Midway, the advance on the Philippines, and Iwo Jima. But when we look at history from the perspective of Japanese aviation, we perceive something deeper: the technical and tactical genius behind a nation that fought to its last breath. The Nakajima B5N was the perfect tool for a type of warfare that would soon cease to exist. A war of aircraft carriers, of human courage facing anti-aircraft fire without modern electronic instruments, without sophisticated radars, relying only on calculation, instinct and faith. Today, very few examples of the B5N remain. Most were lost at sea, sunk along with their aircraft carriers, or destroyed at bombed bases. Some remains were recovered and restored, and are displayed in museums in Japan and the United States, not as trophies, but as memories. When I first saw one of those fragments, a rusty carcass with the red symbol of the rising sun still visible on the fuselage, I felt a chill. I thought of how many men had entrusted their lives to that machine, and how many never returned. The legacy of the Kate lies not only in its military effectiveness, but in what it historically represents: the birth of modern air warfare over the seas. The concept of coordination between torpedo bombers, escort fighters, and dive bombers, something Japan mastered perfectly at the beginning of the conflict, was adopted and improved upon by the Allies. Without the Nakajima B5N, naval aviation might never have evolved as rapidly. It taught us as much through its victories as it did through its mistakes, and in the end, Kate became a silent legend, a ghost over the Pacific, reminding us all that technology may change, but the human spirit behind it, the courage, the fear, the devotion, remains unchanged. When I finished studying the Nakajima B5N, the Kate, I can't help but think about how much the history of war is in fact the history of people. Behind every plane, every mission, there were men, scared, dreaming, with families waiting silently for news that often never came. The Kate was more than a war machine. It was a reflection of the Japanese spirit of its time, precise, disciplined, and deeply devoted to an ideal that for many cost them their lives. I imagine those pilots alone in the vast blue of the Pacific, feeling the roar of the Nakajima engine vibrate beneath their feet. Some knew they might not return. Others simply didn't think about it. They focused on the target, the mission, the honor. The world has changed a lot since then, but their courage, even though it was in service of an empire seeking domination, still inspires respect, because courage, on any side of the war, is always a human trait. The Nakajima B5NH's journey ended as a relic of another time. a time when metal and fire defined the destiny of nations. He began the war as the predator of the seas and ended as a symbol of sacrifice. He was a headache for the Allies, no doubt, but he was also a lesson, a reminder that in war, the greatest power lies not only in weapons, but in the people who wield them. Today, as I gaze at the tranquil skies and reflect on how the world has evolved, I wonder, what have we learned from all this? Perhaps the answer lies in the silence left by the switched-off engines of those planes. A silence that speaks of bravery, but also of loss. And so we conclude another chapter in the history of aviation in World War II. If you've made it this far, thank you very much. Your support keeps alive this journey through the memory of the pilots who changed the course of history. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel. 2. Pilots, turn on notifications and leave a like. It really helps us continue producing high-quality, in-depth historical content, but our journey doesn't end here. In the next video, we're leaving the skies of war to set foot on very different ground, the ground of farms and ranches. Let's explore how the post-war period transformed not only the military world, but also life in the countryside, showing how old war technologies and the spirit of reconstruction helped shape a new era of rural work and prosperity. So, get ready. On the next journey, we will exchange the sound of war engines for the song of the wind through the fields, and the smell of gunpowder for the aroma of the earth. I am narrator's or channel's name, and I'll see you there, because history, just like life, always finds a way to begin again.